Welcome. We still have people joining us, but we're going to start shortly. So we want to say thank you to all of you who have decided to spend your afternoon here with us. We are the Bay Area Poor People's Campaign Speaker Training Group. And when we started preparing the work to help people take up speaker training, we thought, well, then maybe that's a little premature, and then and a request for an orientation for new people came into view. And so we reached out to other Poor People's Campaign chapters, campaigns across the country, and there actually is in Oregon, they have um, uh, uh, what they call onboarding. We decided not to use that particular language, but so we decided to call it a welcoming session. And so this is what we invited you to today. And so we're going to be hearing about the history of the Poor People's Campaign, historically, the current Poor People's Campaign structure, how to be involved, and like that. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions and comments. And so what we want to ask you to do is to put those in the chat, and then we'll be collecting those and sharing those after the presentation. Dave, I see you have your hand up, and if you would put your comment into or question in the chat, that would be good. And so I see a question about, is this for the Bay Area only? It's not. We sent the invitation out statewide because we realized that we have new folks all over the state. And so each region has some things that we do as a region, and then some things that we do statewide. So the speaker training started here in the Bay Area, but the work is, it's about what we are doing here in the Bay Area, but it's also about the state campaign as well as the national campaign. So it's definitely not specific to the Bay Area, although you will get to hear a little bit about what we've been doing here in this region. Okay. And so let me see, I'm wondering, Reverend Rowan, if you're ready.
Ready to go.
That's good. Do that. And
Okay,
welcome.
welcome to my talk. This is an incredibly rich topic, and I'm not going to be able to cover anywhere near as much as I would like to. So I'm mostly not going to read the slides. I hate it when people read slides at me. So I'm going to talk about other things. But if you need more time to read, let me know. I'll start with information on the 1968 Poor People's Campaign and bring you up to date on the modern campaign. Since you want to join us, I'll also be spending some time on organizational information and poverty measures and things that are helpful to understand where we're coming from. Then I'll tell you about recent state and Bay Area work and offer opportunities to jump right in. In 1967-68, leaders from the Southern SCLC, Southern, I'm terrible already, came together to forge a campaign to lift the unjust economic conditions facing millions of people worldwide. And Reverend King's last Sunday sermon, he said, "We're coming to Washington in a poor people's campaign, yes. We're going to bring the tired, the poor, the huddled masses. We're coming to demand that the government address itself to the problem of poverty. We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty, nor the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. We come to ask America to be true to the huge promissory note that it signed years ago, and we're coming to engage in dramatic, nonviolent action to call attention to the gulf between promise and fulfillment, to make the invisible visible. I'm going to talk some about Resurrection City. I just wanted to note this lower photograph. it rained the whole time they were there, and it was just miserable, and they still did amazing work. The campaign was kicked off with a Mother's Day march. Coretta Scott King said, "I firmly believe our last and best hope for the future is brotherhood and peace. It lies in the effective use of women power." Yes, she said brotherhood. It's the era. Robert Kennedy, whose wife attended the Mother's Day opening of Resurrection City, was a great supporter of the '68 campaign. Coretta Scott King and Ethel Kennedy led a march organized by the National Welfare Rights Organization through the poor neighborhoods of Washington. During a rally at Cardozo High School Stadium at the end of the march, Mrs. King called for reform for social service funding, noting that Congress passes laws which subsidize corporations, farms, oil companies, airlines, and houses for suburbia, but was unwilling to make simple investments in programs to help the poor. This disparity in the distribution of government funds became a theme in the Poor People's Campaign. So, as a first step in building the power needed to achieve the radical redistribution of political and economic power, King, along with other leaders in the Poor People's Campaign, such as Johnny Tillman of the National Welfare Rights Organization, helped work on the major elements of a platform. The campaign's tenets were simple: feed the hungry, hire the jobless, care for the sick in slums, protect welfare rights, educate children, respect poor people. And the whole idea of an economic bill of rights actually came from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1944. And his tenets for an economic bill of rights mirror very closely what the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the architects of the Poor People's Campaign, outlined these 5 requirements. And President Roosevelt died 3 months after suggesting an economic bill of rights, and so his grand plan failed. So Bayard Rustin took the SCLC Economic Bill of Rights and created legislative goals, which were also part of the campaign. This information was published in the New York Times on June 5, 1968. Bayard Rustin was a leader in the movement for social rights, socialism, nonviolence, gay rights, and he was working for the National Christian Leadership Conference on the Poor People's Campaign. And I look at these things, these themes from 1968, and they sound like the things we're still fighting for today. It hurts. So the Poor People's Campaign began in Washington, where key leaders of the campaign gathered for lobbying efforts and media events before dispersing around the country to formally launch the 9 regional caravans, bringing thousands of participants to Washington. The Eastern Caravan, the Appalachia Trail, the Southern Caravan, the Midwest Caravan, the Indian Trail, the San Francisco Caravan, the Western Caravan, the Mule Train, and the Freedom Train. This photo is of the Mule Train, a caravan of about 15 covered wagons, painting with slogans such as "Jesus was a poor man" and "Feed the poor," which came up from Marks, Mississippi, which was the poorest hamlet in the poorest state in the country. And the mule and the covered wagons were a symbolic message of the Black sharecropper. Resurrection City housed more than 3,000 people, and demonstrations and solidarity visits drew many thousands more to the encampment during the 6 weeks of existence. Residents braved torrential rains, interminable mud, undercover informants, and hostile police. Resurrection City programs included a child care center, health and social services, a poor people's university with ongoing seminars and lectures, free meals, a daily newspaper, cultural activities in the Soul Center, a city council, a finance committee, and a public relations center. More than 55,000 people gathered on Solidarity Day, held on June 19th in commemoration of Juneteenth. And I always have to bring in the Diggers because they were very famous in San Francisco at the time. They had a free food and free store that they would put up in Golden Gate Park. And they came out to the Poor People's Campaign. One of the testifiers at the Indigenous gathering in the 2020 PPC said, when he was there, it was the first time that some of the citizens of Resurrection City had ever had wheat bread. He also said that for some folks, They got shoes from the free store, and it was their first pair of shoes. And then on April 4th, 1968, the Reverend Dr. King was assassinated. And the unity and organization needed for the Poor People's Campaign of 1968 to complete all three phases and form the new unsettling force capable of disrupting complacent national life and achieving an economic Bill of Rights was not easy to come by. The assassination of Dr. King and Senator Robert Kennedy, a key proponent of the campaign and presidential candidate, served to cripple the campaign and greatly limit its impact. Midway through the campaign, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Out of respect for the campaign, his funeral procession passed through Resurrection City. The Department of the Interior forced Resurrection City to close on June 24th, 1968, after the permit on parkland expired. But they visited the Justice Department, the Interior Department. The speeches are available. They're prepared speeches for those, and it's amazing. They're talking about exactly the things that we're fighting for today. And then we have the modern campaign. We aim to stand on the shoulders of those who came before and put effort into learning lessons and getting into step together. To give you a glimpse of the modern origins of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, we'll start with a video.
Next, an effort to revive a famous movement of the 1960s focused on reducing poverty, inequality, and tackling social justice. But with such a broad agenda, will it find enough support at this polarized time? We start with a look at the campaign that began 50 years ago. Shortly before his death in 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. expanded his civil rights campaign to include calls for economic justice. He called for an economic revolution that included protection and services for the poorest Americans. He would call it the Poor People's Campaign.
We are coming to get our check.
The campaign would bring together poor people from across the country and from across racial, ethnic, and geographic lines, including poor whites, for a march on Washington.
Even if you have to bring a whole family, we are going to have in Washington facilities, and we're going to have food, and we are going to demand that the government do something about these conditions.
The first step was to construct a shanty town called Resurrection City on the National Mall, housing thousands of participants in a form of nonviolent civil disobedience. Dr. King himself would never make it to the March on Washington. He died that spring. But weeks after his assassination, 50,000 people gathered in solidarity, demanding economic reform on the steps where Dr. King had professed, "I have a dream."
We come with an appeal to open the doors of America to the almost 50 million Americans who have not been given a fair share of America's wealth and opportunity.
Half a century later, a group of religious and moral leaders are planning a wave of civil disobedience in Washington, a revival of the Poor People's Campaign. It is headed in part by the Reverend William Barber, who's the co-chair of the campaign. He led demonstrators at a rally in front of the U.S. Capitol this month, and he was arrested, alongside the Reverend Jesse Jackson, a key figure in the 1968 movement. I spoke with Reverend Barber recently when he was in Washington. Reverend William Barber, welcome to the NewsHour. Thank you very much for joining us. When the original Poor People's Campaign took place, it was 50 years ago. Dr. Martin Luther King was involved. After he was assassinated, it continued. But what is the connection between then and now?
Well, thank you so much for having us. And on behalf of the campaign, the National Poor People's Campaign, National Call for Moral Revival, and my co-chair, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, let me say that the connection was, first of all, that it did continue, that people realized Dr. King was right. Racism, poverty, and militarism were interconnected. The connection today is we did a study, we commissioned a study with the Institute for Policy Studies and also had some help with Urban Institute, anecdotal and empirical data. And we did something called the Souls of Poor Folk, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. What did we find? Today, there are 140 million poor and low wealth people. Today, there are 250,000 people that die every year from low wealth. We have less voting rights today because of the gutting of the Voting Rights Act than we had in 1965. And we have 62 million people who are working poor, who work for less than a living wage, and 14 million children who are in poverty.
Those numbers are overwhelming. They are daunting. You're not proposing to do away with poverty, are you?
We are saying that there are 5 interlocking injustices that America has to face because they continue to cause policy violence. That is systemic racism, particularly seen through the lens of voter suppression, where people use voter suppression to get elected, and then once they get elected, they pass policies that hurt the poor, mostly white women, children, and the working poor. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy and militarism, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that says you don't have to address those issues. We are saying, yes, America is going to have to face these 5 interlocking injustices and change them.
Why can't you work through the existing political system, work to elect political figures who agree with your agenda?
Well, several reasons. Number one, we had 26 presidential debates in the last presidential election. On the Democrat and Republican side, not 1 hour was spent on poverty. Not 1 hour was spent on voter suppression and restoring the Voting Rights Act. Not 1 hour on the war economy and militarism. So if we're not even having the conversation, the first thing we have to change is the attention violence. We have an attention violence when it comes to poverty and the poor, and we must change that before you can change the agenda. And it must be a movement of the people from the bottom up.
Reverend Barber, I talk to people, I've read folks who agree with much of what you are saying you want, but they also are saying you're asking for too many different things, that you should narrow your list of ambitions, that you'll have a much better chance at getting something done.
Well, then those same people should say narrow the Constitution because it's pretty ambitious. It says domestic tranquility, establishment of justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the welfare, general welfare. Narrow the moral call of the Bible that says you're supposed to care for the stranger, the hungry, the sick, the left out, the lonely, the imprisoned. Why is it that that wealthy and greed gets to ask for everything? They want tax cuts, they get that. They want to block health care, they get that. But then we tell poor people, you have to ask for one thing. 37 million people without health care, we have to fight for health care. Millions of people without living wages, we can't just ask for one thing because they are systemically interlocking injustices.
If there are so many who you define as poor in this country, why aren't we seeing more people rise up and make this argument? I mean, it's right now it's left to you and a relatively small group of people who are making this argument, having the march, having your demonstrations and so forth.
Well, I don't know if I would say a relatively small group. We have organizing committees in 40 states. We have people who are organizing. In the last 2 weeks, we've had thousands of people attend. Over nearly 2,000 people do civil disobedience, more than ever in the history of this country, simultaneously doing nonviolent moral fusion, civil disobedience. There is a rising, and why? And so what we're doing is we're launching a movement. We're not ending a movement. We're launching a movement and calling people to action. Many people do not know how bad it is, and many people who are poor and low wealth have been broken and pushed down and ignored. But where we're going from West Virginia to Wisconsin, from Alabama to Alaska, we're finding that there are thousands of people who are saying it's time for us to stand up and refuse to be silent.
You've said that the nation's problem is not that we don't have enough money. You said it's that we don't have the moral capacity to face what ails society. What did you mean by that?
That when you look at our deepest moral framework of the Constitution and our deepest moral values of our religious tradition, we too often have a political conversation that talks about left versus right, military or middle class. That's too puny, it's too narrow. 43.5% of this country is poor and low wealth. People are dying. Even Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, said that America has to face the cost of inequality. What I'm saying is we can't just have a left-right argument anymore. We need to have a deeply moral argument that says This is not just about Democrats or Republicans. This is about America. What kind of democracy do we want to be? You cannot have a democracy continue to exist when 400 people make an average of $97,000 an hour and you lock people up who simply want 15 in the union.
Does either political party come closer to your goals?
Well, I think they can. I think they hit at it. I think, of course, the extremists who have taken over the Republican Party have just gone so far extreme. You know, they're more focused on tax cuts to the wealthy. They want to blame poor people for their problems. Democrats, on the other hand, are willing to talk about, say, the Affordable Care Act and talk about the middle class. But the reality is neither party is willing to put right in front of America the issues of systemic racism, of systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and say the word poverty. It's almost as though we've tried to remove even saying the word poverty, when in fact the majority of the poor people in this country are white, women, children, working people, and the disabled. So we have to change our narrative in this country. And the only way you can change the narrative is to change the narrator. That's why this campaign is focused on three things: breaking through the narrative, massive voter mobilization among the poor, and power building from the bottom up.
Reverend William Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
In 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Reverend Dr., now he's Bishop Barber, I have to start changing how I talk about him, was the president of the North Carolina NAACP. And he said, the only thing you can do with the assassination of a prophet to truly honor them is to reach down into the blood, pick up the baton, and carry it the next mile of the way. So we've picked up the baton from the Poor People's Campaign of 1968. And Bishop Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris are the co-chairs of the modern campaign. Before they started the Poor People's Campaign, though, they started Moral Mondays. Dr. Barber and his allies sat in, protested, and were arrested for several years at the North Carolina State House. During the forced protest on April 29, 2013, about 100 people showed up, of whom 17 were arrested. The Wall Street Journal credited Barber's NAACP chapter with forming a coalition in 2007 called the Historic Thousands on Jones Street's People's Assembly, composed of 93 North Carolina advocacy groups. As the movement built momentum, more than 900 demonstrators were arrested as part of the Moral Monday movement, and police estimated that weekly attendance was over 2,500. In 2014, the Moral Monday movement gathered an estimated 80,000 people for a march on February 14th. In 2020, we've been doing Facebook Live Moral Mondays, and millions of people have called Mitch McConnell to ask for COVID-19 relief. So we will be continuing Moral Mondays. After a year of Moral Monday actions, here's the march: 80,000 people, 93 advocacy organizations in coalition. Then in 1915, Reverend Barber and others from the Moral Monday movement created Repairers of the Breach, dedicated to a moral agenda rooted in moral and constitutional values. On September 12, 2016, activists from Moral Monday, Repairers of the Breach, the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, Social Justice, with labor organizers from Fight for 15, faith leaders like Sister Simone Campbell and the Nuns on the Bus, and religious and political groups across the nation organized a Moral Day of Action with simultaneous protests in their state capitals, 30 state capitals. They delivered the Higher Ground Moral Declaration to their respective state elected officials. In 2016, Repairers of the Breach made a commitment to revive the Poor People's Campaign with the Cairo Center and hundreds of churches and grassroots organizations across the country. And we're in more than 40 states, building from the bottom up. And one of the things that Reverend Barber says is that you can't talk about change if you don't have the facts. So the first thing the campaign did was the Souls of Poor Folks Moral Audit, which updated the information on the 4 themes from the 1968 campaign: systemic racism, poverty, militarism, the war economy, and ecological devastation. And that was released in 2017 with the release of the launch of the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C., with the full report coming out in April of 2018. This provided data-driven analysis of the historical and empirical realities that these 4 evils in the past 50 years. It is informed by interviews, testimony, hearings with impact people coming together with scholarly research. And the Moral Agenda and Declaration of Fundamental Rights includes the history behind and moral justification for this moral agenda. Then Poor People's Moral Budget. There's 7 sections of the budget where we look at policies and investments for 7 critical areas of the Poor People's Campaign's agenda: democracy and equal protection under the law, domestic tranquility, peace and the common defense, life and health, the planet, our future, and an equitable economy. Unleashing the Power of Poor and Low-Income Americans was a recent thing, and we found that voting behaviors of millions of people relative to the size of the total electorate, as well as voting margins by state, and we believe the findings support our analysis that organizations among the poor around an agenda that represents the concerns of the poor can fundamentally change the political map of this country and lead to policies that are just and representative for all Americans. And so we keep talking about poverty. And so I'm going to do a little bit about how we measure poverty. When the federal government talks about poverty, they use the official poverty measure, which says that a single person making more than $11,880 under the age of 65 is not poor. You have to make less than that to be poor. And a household of 4 making over $24,300, they're not poor. So when we talk about poverty, we tend to use the supplemental poverty measure, which was developed by the Census Bureau, because it takes into account people's actual costs as well as their income. And so using the SPM, these are the kinds of numbers you find. I couldn't find the 2017 population figure, but in 2018, the US population was 327.2 million. The PPC gives the percent of people who are poor or low income in 2017 is 43%. Of course, we know with COVID, that number has probably gone way up. The information on poverty and low income status of First Nations, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, LGBTQIA, and disabled people is scant, even under the SPM. According to existing information from the OPM, 26.2% of Native Americans were living below the federal policy level. That's 1.7 million people. 26.6% of people with disabilities were living before the poverty level. That's 5.3 million people. Transgender people are likely to experience poverty at a rate double that of the general population, with transgender people of color experiencing even higher poverty ratios. We know that because the OPM is a very limited measure of poverty, these numbers do not reflect the full scale of poverty among those populations. And next, I'll share about the various bus tours and listening campaigns over the past few years, beginning with a video from Repairers of the Breach. Well, I'm not actually going to begin with a video. I'm going to talk to you first. So part of grassroots organizing is to go out and listen and engage with the people most affected by the policies that keep poor people down. The Poor People's Campaign has taken bus tours to engage with their base and form state organizing committees. This video is of the 2019 Truth and Poverty bus tour from Repairers of the Breach, and it illustrates the kinds of testimonies received during these tours.
What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's happening on the real streets of America. What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's happening on the real streets of America.
Well, there are thousands who are not free. Yeah. And we know when one person is not free, none of us are free. Yeah. And we know that this isn't the case in God's economy. It doesn't have to be this way.
That's right.
We can do better.
We can do better! We can do better!
In America, we are taught that if you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are dispossessed, disenfranchised, it's because you've done something wrong. It's because you are inferior. It is because you are insufficient. And we believe that that is wrong. There are 140 million people in the United States who either live in poverty or are low income, who are one paycheck away from being homeless, or one wildfire away from being homeless, or one missed rent check or car payment away from being homeless. That's over a third of the United States. Now, to me, that is our deep shame as a country. That is a moral emergency, and that's why we need a Poor People's Campaign across the entire nation. We are identifying ourselves with this movement. And what that means is we're saying, hey, we're part of something bigger.
I understand some things about poverty because I am a poor person. We believe that when poor people name their own priorities because they know their own needs and know what needs to happen, that real change will be produced. If poor people are not allowed to speak these priorities for themselves, no one else will.
It's hard enough just to live on this earth and survive. And it shouldn't make it any more difficult. You shouldn't be homeless and be a criminal just because you're homeless. That's right. It's sad. Sad.
The homelessness that you're seeing in the streets of LA, in our community, you can see it all up and down the state. People encamped in the streets, living in their cars, in RVs, in garages. It's a growing phenomenon. And one thing that's important for me to point out, I don't think this is because people just don't know how to manage their finances. This is an economic devastation based on a systemic root.
She said it wasn't a tornado. The tornadoes came, and then it was they dropped enough, but then after that, then another storm came. Right. And that's what created all this flood now. And this water is not only dirty, but it's got snakes, alligators. Yeah. And children here.
You know what they said? They said only 2 houses were affected. That's the official report. You can walk down that street right now with your own 2 eyes and see more than 2 houses that were affected. How about if we tell some truth up in here? It's truth-telling time. That which you do to the least of these, you do it unto me.
We thought we were going off to be heroes. But what we found was that we are no more than pawns. And when we come home to live in an unjust and unequal society with the largest prison complex in the world and a political system that seeks to oppress voting rather than to expand it.
North Carolina A&T students has the largest population and concentration of young eligible black voters in this state.
Speak a word, Nick.
So this is the line, Leslie. It goes all the way down. You've got these dormitories over here.
And those over there.
And those are on the other side. Yeah, as far as we can tell, this is the only HBCU like this.
I acknowledge freely that this would be a political gerrymander, which is not against the law. I think electing Republicans is better than electing Democrats. So I drew this map to help foster what I think is better for the country. I want to push back against the words of a racist and acknowledge that what happened on this campus was racist gerrymandering and not political gerrymandering. This was an attempt to suppress the black student vote.
Something's got to be done to help people with disabilities to vote. One of my concerns is when I went to vote, when the little sheet came out of the thing that showed what I voted for, I couldn't read it. It was in small print.
Let the people vote! That's how you honor veterans.
I get tired of hearing a certain false narrative. And it's that people like myself are weak, lazy, and immoral. But this is far from the truth because weak, lazy, and immoral is letting human beings live in the streets while billionaires receive trillion-dollar tax cuts. Come on now. Come on now. Denying health care to millions, cutting social services for the poor, and privatizing the VA while dropping bombs on brown people 1,000 miles away, diverting money from poor Americans to pay for those bombs and lying for the reasons why the bombs are even being dropped, caging immigrant children, ignoring ecological devastation in poor communities is weak, lazy, and immoral.
This was the site of the first of the 3 major fires that Lewiston experienced in 2013. They were all arson, and there was a lot of agreement that the fires themselves were tragic, but it surfaced this ongoing tension that we have in the community over, who we consider to be a part of our community. And many times it's not even coded. It's literally, we have too many immigrants, their homes burnt down, so let's not rebuild them because, we need less people like that here.
They tell you something is wrong. Mm-hmm. All of us are suffering from the same thing. Heart disease, asthma. All of these same sickness. Something is wrong.
That's right.
Why is nobody doing it? Why is nobody researching it?
That's right.
I have no way out. The federal government have posted on everything. Nobody cares about us. Did you hear me?
Look at everything the United States is doing. Look at all the wealth. That's all ours. I mean, that's all the Native American. It's easy to lose that focus because everybody came in that second chapter. But they got to go to the first chapter. The first chapter is going to tell the story of this country. And then Congress or nobody can turn away from it. So, this Poor People's Campaign needs to know that they have artillery, religious artillery that can help the movement. But if you don't recognize us, then it goes back to that second chapter that we're the forgotten ones.
There are currently more than 11,000 unaccompanied children in the care of the U.S. and Humane Services. This policy is inhumane. It is immoral. To remain silent is to be complicit.
There is no individual solution to the social and economic problems that working women face.
We do not live in a mom-friendly or child-friendly country. We face inadequate paid maternity leave, abysmal postpartum health care, and equally appalling access to quality child care and public education. I feel expendable, and if I am expendable, so too are children, and that I cannot stand for.
So we have to hold these politicians accountable. That's where our problem is. In St. John, people are not participating in these elections because these people who we elect, they are not representing us.
There's other systems here that are oppressing us that voting won't always fix, and that we've got to talk about, we've got to call it out, and we've got to mobilize and build a movement to be able to change these things that our politicians won't always change.
But I have to tell you, there's something going on in this nation right now. There's a beautiful birth of a movement, and it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us to stand up and say, I lived at a time when kids were going hungry and homeless, when they were closing hospitals and healthcare centers, when racists were emboldened. But I linked arms with people. I stood up and acted for justice, and we changed it. We changed it.
Forward together! Not one step back.
It's movement time. It's time to shake this nation because this nation is locked up. Our politics are small and banging, but we are those who can see the cracks in the walls and the way to come out of the cells. And we are determined to be free. And we're determined to see other folk free. Free with living wages. Right? Free. Free with health care. Free. Free with food on their tables, and free with good housing, and free with good water and land and air. And free with justice. That is the call of this movement. And we are the front line.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want?
What happens in Wall Street?
So the most recent tour was the 22-state MORE tour. MORE is mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating national tour that kicked off on June 2019 and was meant to go until May 2020. Our wonderful December 2019 stop in San Francisco was one of the last live events. There's some photos of that here. In the initial chaos of the pandemic, 4 states had their tour stops canceled, but soon the campaign took to Facebook Live, YouTube Live, and Zoom. Local problems were highlighted in virtual tour stops with local testifiers and leaders. Recordings of these Facebook Live feeds are available on the National Campaign's Facebook page. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Moral Action Congress, which took place in June of 2019. We had a candidates forum, we had lots of plenaries and workshops and breakout sessions, and we brought the moral budget to the Congressional Budget Committee. Greg Kaufman of The Nation summed up the forum. As for policy, there was quite a bit that the candidates agreed on: a restoration and expansion of the Voting Rights Act, universal pre-K and affordable childcare, a $15 minimum wage, healthcare as a right, repealing the Trump tax cut for the wealthy, bringing the troops home from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and reallocating these billions of dollars domestically, making college affordable or free. There were also a shared sense that the scarcity of resources is a myth. The United States has plenty of money to do big things. Candidates also seem to agree broadly that Democrats must respond to the right's attempt to use race to pit poor people against one another by investing time and energy in building a multiracial coalition. We took the budget to the Congressional Budget Committee, and Nancy Pelosi, who is not on the Budget Committee, asked them if she could be present, and she was, to hear testifiers from the campaign and the leaders talk about the budget. The budget challenges the idea that poverty is the fault of the poor. Instead, it finds that poverty is caused by structure and immoral policies, and therefore it will take moral policies and larger social transformations to lift the load of poverty. And here's just some pictures from that event. There's some amazing videos on YouTube of the actual testimony, and I recommend checking them out. So because you want to be involved in the Poor People's Campaign, I'm going to talk a little bit about organization and theory. The National Campaign is run by staff from Repairs of the Breach and the Kairos Center. Each state organization has a coordinating committee which has 3 chairs, an impacted person, a faith leader, and an organizer. Because of California's size, we also have several regional steering committees: San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, Inland Empire, Sacramento, Orange County, and San Diego. And instead of having tri-chairs like all the other states, we have a 4th co-chair. We're just that big. So, and at every level, there are working groups. The California working groups are structure, policy/political education, communications, faith leaders, finances/fundraising, legal, arts, and theomusicology, because arts and theomusicology are really at the heart of our movement. And the regional steering committees have some, if not all, of these working groups that you can get involved in. So Reverend Barber put forward the 14 principles of moral fusion organizing. These steps are set forth in the Third Reconstruction, which is a great book. I recommend it. It depends on a moral movement deeply rooted in the South, emerging state by state throughout the nation. No single leader or organization can orchestrate such a movement, but we have seen the power of fusion organizing in North Carolina, establish an education center, Repairs of the Breach, to share the lessons of Moral Mondays and invest in equipping leaders from other state-based coalitions. In order to move forward together, we've outlined these 14 steps to mobilize in the streets, at the polls, and in the courtrooms. And so these are some of the core principles that we follow in the campaign. And our goals are really easy: voting rights, healthcare, housing, equitable education, indigenous sovereignty, living wage jobs, and the right to join a union, clean air and water, and an end to gun proliferation and warmongering. So very much the same kinds of things that the economic platform of 1968 was going for. And we read the fundamental principles at the beginning of many local meetings to ground ourselves in the work. They're worth time studying if you want to get involved. This is why we're doing what we're doing, and this is what we believe. So I'm not going to really give you time to read them because there's a lot of them. But the last principle I want to draw your attention to, and it's particularly important for folks considering joining the campaign as a volunteer. Violent tactics or actions will not be tolerated, period. You will be asked to sign a covenant of nonviolence as part of joining the California Poor People's Campaign. And so, wow, you've joined. What kinds of things might you be working on next? I mentioned the studies and documents slide that one of our documents is the Poor People's Campaign Moral Justice Jubilee platform, which forms the basis of our current work. I'll show a video from the Cairo Center about the Jubilee platform and then talk about its sections and principles. I'll mention here that the meaning of the word Jubilee, for those unfamiliar with the term. In Judaism, a Jubilee year is the year of emancipation of slaves and prisoners, forgiveness of debts, restoration of alienated lands to their former owners, and rest from cultivation for the land. And this was provided in Hebrew law to be every 50 years. In the Catholic Church, the Jubilee year is every 25 years, and it's for the remission of sins and universal pardon. In an interfaith context, Jubilee is most often about debt relief. The Parliament of the World's Religions in 2004 called for the world to declare Jubilee and relieve the burden of international debt. So the Poor People's Jubilee platform can be seen in that context.
From Alaska to Arkansas, the Carolinas to California, Mississippi to Maine, Kansas to Kentucky, the Bronx to the border, Appalachian Hollers to Apache sacred lands, people are coming together to organize their moral outrage against systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism, and the war economy, and the false narrative of religious nationalism into a powerful moral fusion movement.
There are 140 million people who are poor and struggling against these injustices in the richest country in the world. A society sick with these injustices needs a voice rooted in our deepest moral and constitutional values to remind us of who we are and who we must be.
A moral policy agenda to heal the nation. The Poor People's Jubilee platform proclaims that moral policy is economically sound policy. That the 140 million are not only the hope of the poor, that the least of these, who are in actuality most of us, can lead the nation out of the pain that it's been feeling.
The rejected are leading a moral and economic revival to save the heart and soul of this nation. Our platform is grounded in 5 principles.
We need a moral revolution of values to repair the breach in our society. This platform abides by our deepest constitutional and moral commitments to justice. Where harm has been done, it must be acknowledged and undone.
Everybody in, nobody out. Too many people are hurting, and we can't be silent anymore.
When you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Instead of trickle down, we start with bottom up.
Prioritize the leadership of the poor, low income, and most impacted. Those who are on the front lines of these crises must also be in the lead in identifying their solutions.
Debts that cannot be paid must be relieved. We demand freedom from servicing debts that cannot be paid.
The Poor People's Jubilee platform now identifies policy and legislative priorities to heal our nation.
We've been investing in punishing the poor, but we must now invest in the welfare of all. We've been investing in systemic racism and voter suppression, but we must now invest in expanding democracy.
We have been investing in killing people. We now must invest in life.
We have been investing in the wealthy and corporations. We must now invest in the people who have built up this country and make it run every day. The 140 million and more who have been abandoned in an era of abundance.
Somebody's been hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
We won't be silent anymore.
Not be silent anymore.
So here are the 5 sections of the principles that they elucidated in the video. I don't need to go over those again. And likewise, this is what they talked about, but I wanted them here in case you wanted to like take a screenshot or know to go to look for the Jubilee platform on our website. So that's the national campaign. And I was going to talk a little bit about some of the state actions in California. People from all over the state submitted letters for Everybody's Got a Right to Live, which is one of our big slogans. And recently we were working on similar posters that said vote in Spanish, English, and ESL. And these are all just from 2020, things that were happening. We stood up against the oil companies, along with many environmentalists in California. We distributed 20,000 door hangers, giving people information about the census and voter information. And these pictures are from LA, from Sacramento, and from San Jose. Recently, we tried to stop a super spreader event in the Los Angeles area. Foyt's events were not canceled, but they didn't go as planned. Here's what changed thanks to the local outcry and the help from the Poor People's Campaign. The main event was moved from its original location just blocks from Skid Row to Valencia. The Poor People's Campaign hosted a Facebook Live meeting attended by some of the 60-plus face leaders who had signed a statement drafted by the California PPC that spoke out against Foyt's actions. The video was viewed by more than 1,500 people. Thanks to LACAN and the Church Without Walls, a smaller Let Us Worship event in Skid Row was met with a blockade of roughly 100 cars. We're getting really good at this car caravan thing. The mayor's office showed us at the third Foyt event, this one in Echo Park, with 10,000 masks. More than a dozen news outlets covered our actions, including CBS News and the Sacramento Bee, and a religious news article co-authored by Pastor Hughes titled LA's Skid Row Doesn't Need Sean Foyt's Revival sparked a heated online conversation that continues even now. And Foyt is currently in Texas, but he plans to come back from California. Our legal working group came up with a 6-page document with why it wasn't legal for him to do it, even though the local politicians didn't step in the way they should have. So might need this again, folks. And then here are some local actions in the Bay Area. There's been a McDonald's strike. There's a McDonald's franchise that owns 5 stores in Oakland, and they were having their workers in desperately unsafe work conditions, and many of them and their children got sick. And so we supported them with art builds and strikes and actions and continue to do so. So Moral Mondays, we all got together across the country and we were calling Mitch McConnell. And then in September, the people in Kentucky had car caravans to every single McConnell headquarters in the state. And so all the rest of the states got involved. And so around California, including in San Francisco, people got in their cars and went to the offices of local senators and calling on them to stand up and fight for a full and just stimulus relief package. Another art build, this was for No Evictions. We collaborated with the Cardboard and Concrete Unhoused Artists Collective and did this street mural. It was power washed away the next day, But it's one of those circles in the Democracy, Choose Democracy, Stop a Coup mural, which they pledged they would not power wash away. And many of us worked on the mural. There was music, there were mural painting and trainings to help communities get organized, strong-hearted, and ready to take positive action to stop a possible coup attempt during the November federal elections. And so what's happening right now? Well, we still have a petition that we did at the beginning of COVID. So far, it only has 83,000 signatures, and we really want to get to 100,000, so it's still up for signatures. We have 14 policy priorities to heal the nation, which we are actually in conversation with the Biden transition team. We'll be part of the people who are helping them figure out domestic policy, and that's extremely exciting. There are 14 policy priorities, which may show up in the chat. We have a COVID-19 and poverty memorial wall. If you have lost someone you care about to COVID-19 or to poverty, we encourage you to add their name and picture to the memorial wall. And we are doing Moral Mondays again. I'm not sure what the theme will be going forward, but we're definitely meeting every week, and it's really worth going to. I don't know if you went to this Monday's Moral Monday on Martin Luther King Day, but there were so many wonderful speakers. And how to join us. Here you go. And this should also be in the chat. There's the Poor People's Campaign website. There's YouTube channels for the Poor People's Campaign. But I recommend that you also look at Repairers of the Breach and the Kairos Center for inspirational videos. And actually, I should put those in the URL thing, because breachrepairers.org and the Kairos Center both have policy papers and things that don't appear on the Poor People's Campaign website that I think if you're getting involved and you're interested in policy and that kind of thing, you might want to check out the Kairos Center and Breach Repairers as well. We're on Facebook at the National, California, and Bay Area level. I'm sure other parts of the state have their own Facebook pages, but I was creating this for a Bay Area audience. I apologize. And so there's also those levels of Twitter, and once again, the working groups. And in the Bay Area, you can get involved by writing info at poorpeoplescampaignbayarea.org. And I'm kind of running out of time, or I would play you this lovely song. But everybody. Oh. But in the campaign, we say forward together, and folks respond, not one step back. So will you chant with me? You can unmute. Forward together, not one step back. Okay. Well, I hope you were saying it at home anyway. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry that everybody was on mute and not able to unmute themselves, Reverend Rowan, and so we'll have to finish with that. So thank you, Reverend Rowan, for that lovely presentation. So it was jam-packed with information. And so I want to see if folks have any questions that you want to raise. If you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to at this point. Yeah, if you have any questions or comments, we're going to be ending soon. But before you go, we want to ask you to fill out a form with feedback, comments, questions. I'll put that in the chat so that we can hear from you. And if you have questions about anything that you saw, you can either say it now or let us know in the chat. Our plan is to have welcome sessions monthly. And so your feedback is really critical so that we can be sure that, you know, we're meeting the needs that are in the community of people who are new to the PPC. Let's see. And so I see a question in the chat. Who is PPC for Inland Empire? That would be Rose Guadell Escobar. And if you want to put your contact info in the chat, I can put her in touch with you. She's one of the co-chairs for California. There are 4 co-chairs for California: Rose Guadell Escobar in the Inland Empire, Reverend Beth Johnson in San Diego, Faith Kennedy Wilson in Sacramento, and I have the honor of also serving as one of the California co-chairs. And I see Linda Chapman has their hand raised.
Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I worked in the original Poor People's Campaign. I was working for President Johnson's War on Poverty when the Poor People's Campaign came to town, and I was at Resurrection City. So I was thrilled in 2019 to see the announcement that this was going to happen in San Francisco. And for one thing, I tried to involve the Board of Supervisors in having a day in honor of this. I mean, they have resolutions for everything. It could be an event in some foreign country, but they, it didn't matter to them exactly. And there was no publicity about it whatsoever. And I was unable in trying to communicate with whoever the people here were locally, I don't know what you would say, to get an understanding of what needed to be done to organize. In San Francisco, my God, this progressive place where there are all kinds of organizations that could have been reached out to. And finally, I gave up. So, I would like to be involved, but it was as if, people had very good will, and it's fine to talk about the things you're involved with. That's important. But there was an organization task to be done that wasn't happening. So that's my comment.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your feedback. Like any movement, any effort to bring change, it's imperfect. And so that's why we ask for feedback. And so we will take that under consideration and invite you to try again.
Okay.
Thanks. Anybody else have questions or comments? Okay, so I see that Jason Anthony, are you still with us? Well, Jason Anthony was part of he was at Resurrection City back in '68. And so that's really exciting to have somebody who has direct experience with the original Poor People's Campaign, as well as the new Poor People's Campaign. So we want to thank you for being here. Reverend Rowan, thank you so much for your presentation. And I want to also thank the other members of the speaker training working group who are here and have worked really hard to create templates and resources for people who are going to be speaking to folks around the Poor People's Campaign. And so Abraham Enton is here with us. If you could wave, Abraham, so people who are in your gallery view can see you, or maybe you can say a word. Are you on mute?
Thanks, Nell. I appreciate the appreciation, and it's always a pleasure to work on this important initiative.
Great, thanks so much. And Mary Claire Newman, would you like to greet our group here?
Yes, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Reverend Rowan and Nell and Abraham and everybody else that's been working on this. Just so you know, this is our first one of these. So we do appreciate the feedback. Please let us know what we can do to improve it and any other questions. Thank you.
Great. All righty. So if there are no other questions or comments at this time, we want to thank you. And Reverend Rowan, do you want to lead us in the chant again, given that everybody is off mute now?
Unmute yourselves.
Yes. Forward together.
Not
one step back.
Backward. Back.
Okay, thank you so much. Nona, I see that you have your hand up. Anna,
yeah. I just entered 2 things in the chat, my phone number and my email, because I don't know how to get a hold of anybody. I live in Chico, where there's a university, and I'm not really good at organizing, but I'm learning by attending things like this. And I'm also sheltered in, so I have the challenge of doing something from my phone or Zoom, but that doesn't mean I can't help.
No, it doesn't mean you can't. But, most of our organizing is virtual at this point anyway, because of COVID. We really have been quite careful about supporting people to protect themselves from this really, the pandemic of COVID. And so a lot of our organizing is actually online. We have done some car caravans that have been low risk and, with COVID precautions, and also some art bills, but we are very careful when we call for things to happen in person. So I'm going to save the chat and I'll look for your contact info.
Yeah, it's kind of clumsily put in.
Okay.
I have a hard time working this phone. But I have my email address and I have my phone number in 2 separate messages.
Okay, I'll look for
Will
that.
my name appear on it when you get the messages?
Yes.
Okay,
In
good.
the chat, yeah. No.
I'm a little bit challenged here.
Okay, well, I hear you. And
I love the Poor People's Campaign and can't wait to get more involved.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass your name to Faye Kennedy Wilson, because like I mentioned earlier, she's in Sacramento and they're doing a lot of organizing on the ground in Sacramento. So on the ground, meaning in the ether for the most part. So
thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for being here. And I see that Victoria Rue has her hand raised.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Thank you. And thank you for this presentation. I'd like to ask, are you doing any organizing either in the Bay Area or nationally or anywhere with just pastors to get the word out about the Poor People's Campaign? Is there any place that you're working just with pastors?
So I'm going to invite Randy Webster. If Randy is still on the call, are you here, Randy?
Here on the call, yes. Hello. I'm sorry, I was responding to someone in the chat and did not hear your question. So, yeah, please, could you repeat what you said?
I'm wondering if there is either. I live in the Bay Area and I'm a member of Roman Catholic women priests. And we have a network of women all over the country that we would like to plug in, if you will, to collaborate with the Poor People's Campaign. And certainly here in the West, we have a whole series of congregations. So I'm wondering, how should we do that?
Well, do you know a woman named Dr. Mary Crosby or Tom Piazza?
Tom Piazza, yes.
Yes, well, they're very good friends of mine and colleagues, and they actually go to your church. So what I would suggest is, that's a great connection. If you could put your contact info in the chat for me,
sure.
I will follow up with you and we can get together.
Super. Thank you very much, Randy.
Victoria.
So any last thoughts or questions? Reverend Rowan, there was a request for the song. I see Lori Sundholm has her hand up. Let's take Lori's question. And then maybe
the song. You mentioned contact information for Sacramento. Can I get that too? I'm closer to Sacramento than the Bay Area.
Okay. Probably what will work best is if you put your contact info in the chat.
Okay.
And then I'll pass that on to Faye Wilson Kennedy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say, Randy didn't say, but she's the convener of the Faith Leaders Outreach Group. And we meet every 2 weeks and talk faith leader to faith leader about the campaign and about actions we want to take or things we want to do. So if you're a faith leader and you want to join us, that's an easy way. Contact Randy and we'll get you on the list.
Great.
And so I'm going to share my screen again because I think that the pictures that go with this particular version of the song are really awesome.
Everybody has got a right Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
I feel this melody in the footsteps of the people, rising up in the rhythm of dignity and courage. When I see you, I suddenly believe liberation can flourish, and generosity and humility will save us. And we will use the love our mamas gave us to decolonize the skies above us with praises. Learning from the bravest, the beautiful, nameless creators of a world newly awakened. We on fire and blazing our way out the matrix, guided by a single mother's hand, holding her family together. We already on the other side of never. We're the aunties brewing tea and sipping sweetness from the south to the north. We are here to remind those in DC who they working for. That's right, beloved. This song is Freedom Uncovered.
Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody has got a right. Everybody's got a right to live.
What Harriet walked towards, what the people in Selma marched for, what the riots from Stonewall to Ferguson to Minneapolis fought for. A movement of people who pour in dollars but rich in brilliance. We are the millions, the healers who come to heal, the leaders who come to reveal that the right to live means you've had the right to feel what you feel. The right to live means an end to police violence and the passage of the Green New Deal. The right to live is in the wind, and every day we witness in our children's countless talents. The right to live is harmonizing in the voice of Yara Allen. It is the springtime and you can feel the right to live about to bloom, growing out the organizing of comrades like Sierra and Sharon and Claudia de la Cruz. Esto es el momento de pararnos como madres orgullosas y sonreír, porque no hay nada más esencial que el derecho de vivir. The right to live is a simple truth to return us to ourselves. It is a spell being cast upon a lost and divided nation to heal the wounds of hate and incarceration with a love so bold it includes everybody. Feel that, everybody. And when you fight for those rights, they become the lights for us to follow through these long dark nights. This is a promise to be radically honest and declare we are worthy of food to eat and housing to sleep in and schools to dream in and just being human beings. We are worthy of love. And so the Poor People's Campaign has come to bring our freedom into being. You will know we've arrived because you will hear us sing.
Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live.
Okay, and with that, we want to say thank you again, and please fill out the form. I'll put it in the chat again so that we can get feedback and any other questions that you have that might come up. You can send those, and our goal is to hold these welcome sessions monthly. And so it's really critical that we hear from you about, what worked and what you would like to see happen differently, because we are committed to creating a space where people who are new to the Poor People's Campaign can get grounded, really in the history and the culture and the, the thinking, the structure, our activities, meet each other. One thing I would do differently, we were not quite prepared for the number of RSVPs we got. We actually had over 300 people say they were going to join us, and pretty close to 100 did. So so it's a good problem. We're getting into good trouble, and we had a good problem today. So, but in the future, I'm sure we'll be planning, for people to be in small groups so that you can meet each other and talk with each other about what's happening in your regions and, get support for the kinds of things that you're working on or hoping to take up or like that. So please do give us feedback and let us know, how was it? And with that, we're going to say bye. See you later.
Bye-bye.